Good morning and welcome to the webinar this morning. My name is Nikki Hardwick and I will be presenting the webinar this morning on skills development and hopefully trying to get to understanding how to better get value from your skills development and understanding the different grants that you can apply for. So welcome this morning. I do hope you enjoy the webinar, and after the webinar, this webinar will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So if anybody does need to leave early, you can go back and have a look on our YouTube channel, and you can also view any of the other webinars that we have posted over the last 2 years. So welcome and let's get going. Okay, so today what we're going to be talking about is just a little bit about the Skills Development Act, the Skills Development Levy, understanding the mandatory grant, the discretionary grants, learnerships, and then just very briefly the annual training report and the workplace skills plan. If at the end of the webinar anybody would like to post any questions, you're more than welcome to. Alternatively, you can send me an email. My email address is Nikki @hrtalk.co.za. That's Nikki, @hrtalk.co.za. Okay, so talking a little bit into the Skills Development Act. The Skills Development Act was promulgated in 1998, and much like the Employment Equity Act, it was put into place to help address inequalities in opportunities in the workplace that were created as a result of apartheid. So the main purpose, although a little different to obviously the Employment Equity Act, skills development was then put in place to try and upskill people and share skills within the workplace. So that was the purpose of the Skills Development Act, was to try and create a level playing field for people in the workplace that had not had the same opportunities as a result of apartheid. Okay, so if we look at the Act, the purpose of the Act, and this is taken directly from the Act, was to develop the skills of the South African workforce, firstly to improve the quality of life of workers, their prospects of work and labour mobility, to assist in improving productivity in the workplace and the competitiveness of employers, and then to promote self-employment and to improve the delivery of social services. So the main purpose, if we look at skills development, contrary to what many people believe, the purpose of skills development was actually there to try and assist in not just improving workers' abilities to learn and grow and develop, but obviously to try and assist in the workplace to improve productivity. So when we look at skills development, it's not just about people getting degrees and that sort of thing. The different types of grants that you have and that you can get it's also about improving, very many different skills. So soft skills as well as, actual physical skills like learnerships, apprenticeships, and those sorts of things. So the purpose of skills development is actually to try and assist in the workplace from both an employee perspective as well as an employer perspective. When I say employee, just to bear in mind that with skills development is that there is also a facility within skills development that you can assist people that are not employed by you. So you can do things where they are called unemployed learners as well. Okay, so the purpose of the Act is to increase the level of investment in education and training in the labour market and to improve on that return of investment. Okay, so that is the purpose of the Act. It is also to then encourage employers to use the workplace as an active learning environment. So if we look at any sort of workplace anywhere, and I know this from a recruitment perspective, and any HR person will know that, is one of the biggest challenges that we have, specifically in South Africa, and I can't necessarily say in the world, but I assume it is one of those problems, is that we have people who possibly have qualifications but have no work experience. And having someone in a lot of fields, not every field, but having someone in a lot of fields with no work experience makes it incredibly difficult to employ that person. So one of the things that we have within skills development, and specifically within the Skills Development Act, is to try and encourage employers to allow learners to come into their workplace is to gain work experience, which then substantially will affect their ability to gain employment, because not only do they have a qualification, but they also then have that skill, that experience in the working environment. So this is one of the huge drivers within the Skills Development Act, is to allow learners to not only gain the qualification, but then also to get the workplace experience. Then it is to provide employees with opportunities to acquire new skills, to provide opportunities for new entrants to the labour market to gain the work experience, and then to employ people who would have found it difficult to be employed in the first place. So what it's really trying to do is not only allow people to get the skills within the workplace, but is to create a larger pool of people from which you can possibly employ. So if we take learnerships as an example, you could take 5 or 6 learnerships, and at the end of the learnership is you now have 5 or 6 people that you've invested the time in that you can select from to employ within your workplace. So you may only have 1 position available, but now you have 5 people that you can possibly choose from. And those 5 people have already learned about your workplace and learned about your working environment, and so can integrate easier into your workplace. So again, the whole purpose of this is not just to tick boxes and to submit a report so that you can get your little bit of money back. The purpose of the Skills Development Act was actually to drive a huge amount of learning and development and growth within the workplace and within people who were coming into the workplace, is to create, hopefully, a workforce that had the skills and experience to be able to assist employers to become more productive. Okay, then it was also to encourage workers to participate in learnership and other training programs, to improve the employment prospects of persons previously disadvantaged by unfair discrimination, and then to look at those disadvantages through training and education. So, just in terms of looking at employment equity, one of the things that with employment equity is to redress the disadvantages through the elimination of unfair discrimination. So that was the employment equity. The Skills Development Act goes hand in hand, where it's also then trying to eliminate that unfair discrimination that came into effect as a result of apartheid, through giving everybody access to training and education that they wouldn't ordinarily have had. And then finally is to ensure the quality of education and training for the workplace. Now, this is a little difficult because in as much as we have very many different SETAs, some of the SETAs are not necessarily great, but what we do have is we have the SACWA accreditation, so that you know that if you're going to send people on certain courses, that they have been accredited and that they do meet a certain criteria. So that was the purpose as well. Then we've got to assist work seekers to find work, assist retrenched workers to re-enter the labour market, and then to have employers to find qualified employees, and then to provide and regulate employment services. So that was basically the purpose of the Act. And then this was done by, 3 sort of aspects. So all of these things where we've got the purpose of the Act, this was done by establishing certain things, and the methods and the mechanisms by which they achieved this was the following. And when we go into trying to unpack the best way to try and get the most for your money, is we'll talk into the National Skills Authority, the National Skills Fund, because it starts to make sense when you understand where your money is going and what you can claim back on. Okay, so the first thing that they did was they established an institutional and financial framework, which was the National Skills Authority. Then we have the National Skills Fund, and then we have a Skills Development Levy grant scheme, which then spoke into SETAs, labour centres, and the Skills Development Planning Unit. So over here, we've got the National Skills Authority, the National Skills Fund, which we'll talk into just now, and then we've got our SETAs and that sort of thing. So those are the 3 sort of authorities at the top. Now, most employers will work within the SETAs and that kind of thing. The National Skills Fund actually distributes where the money sort of goes. And the National Skills Authority is the main authority that talks into what are we supposed to be training our people on. Then we were going to, so one of the things is to encourage partnerships between public and private sectors to provide education and training for the workplace, and then cooperating with SAQA, which is the South African Qualifications Authority. So that is how they were intending. So all of those things that I mentioned before, that is basically how they were intending on achieving all of these things. Okay. Now, if we go back into the different things so we can start to understand how everything works, and this is important, although it sounds like a whole lot of legislation and a whole lot of information that I'm giving you that is not relevant, once we can understand how it works, it then assists us as HR people, as managers, when we're trying to apply for training and we're looking at our training within the workplace. If we can understand how this works, we're then better positioned to be able to apply for the right kind of training to get the best money that we can when we submit our workplace skills plan. All right, so when we look at the National Skills Authority, or the NSA actually advises the Minister on Labour on the formulation of the National Skills Strategy and the policy. The NSA then liaises with the SETAs, and based on the reports and the stuff that we send in as employers, so each SETA will obviously gather that information, and they then speak to the NSA, who then will develop the National Skills Strategy. And it's quite important with the National Skills Strategy, because what will happen is as we're submitting every single year, and anybody who's submitted a workplace skills plan, you will see in some of the workplace skills plans, it'll talk about scarce skills and critical skills. Now, what will happen is that they take that information and they start to identify where in South Africa we have skill shortages. So it's quite important that when you're submitting is that you have the correct information. As a result of what they do in there, it feeds in through to the National Skills Authority, and they then start to develop that National Skills Strategy. That then directly starts to fund, or at least filter into things like the NSFAS, which I don't know if everybody has heard of, but that is funding, young students, so people directly out of school and that sort of thing, who have parents that don't earn enough money, that they can actually go and, get a qualification. So they go and they can study for 3 years. It is funded. Yes, they've been in the news for a whole lot of things, but it does work to a large degree. But they will fund certain things to allow people to become qualified. It also funds projects such as Learnerships, such as skills programs, and obviously ABET. But they drive all of those things, and what Learnerships and what degrees and that sort of thing that they will fund based on the information that we as employers are sharing with them with what is happening on the ground. So they ultimately are directing where we as a country are going from a skills shortage perspective. Okay. Then we get to the sector education and training authorities, otherwise known as SETAs. Now, I'm not sure when people are submitting their workplace skills plan and their annual training report, if you're submitting every single year. I'm not sure the number of employers that actually download their sector skills plan. And in developing your training plan, it is always important that you download and you have a look at what the sector skills plan is for your particular SETA, because that will drive for you, and you will be able to identify what is the plan that the SETA has specifically for your SETA? What is the training plan that they have? Where have they identified shortages? What are they focusing their attentions on? So if you take what they're looking at and it works within your business, you can then apply for the same things, and then you're more likely to be approved for possible funding. So with the SETAs, and just to be clear, I assume everybody is aware, but just to be clear, there are a number of different SETAs within South Africa. So there's, I can't name them all, but there's things like Bank SETA, MERS SETA, there's a chemical SETA, so there's services SETA, the financial SETA, hospitality. So there's a number of different SETAs. It's quite important that you as an employer ensure that you are within the correct SETA. So what will happen is when you start as a business, you will do your registration documents with SARS, and as a result of the code that is put in there, it's the SIC code, you will then be allocated to a SETA. Now, initially, you won't necessarily be paying towards the SETA, depending on your salary bill, which we'll get into later, but it's quite important that you are allocated towards the correct SETA, because your SETA will be receiving information from the employers and the businesses within the sector that applies to them. So as an example, if you're in the chemical industry, but you've been incorrectly allocated to the bank SETA or the financial SETA, the skill shortages and the critical and the scarce skills that are identified within that SETA are not going to be the same as you have within the chemical SETA, or at least the chemical industry, for example. So when you're looking at, you're looking at your particular SETA, it's quite important that you're allocated to the correct SETA so that you can take advantage of the trainings and the learnerships and the various things that they have allocated within your particular SETA. Otherwise, you're going to be focusing on things that are in the incorrect SETA. If you do need to change SETA, it is a bit of a process, but it's quite important that you do it when I say at the beginning of the year, so it's the beginning of the skills year rather than right at the end, but you can change them. Anyway, going back to the SETAs. So what the SETAs are then required to do, they need to develop a sector skills plan, okay, which then comes directly from the National Skills Plan and the National Skills Development Strategy. They implement the sector skills plan by looking at learnerships. They approve your workplace skills plan. So they will look at the workplace skills plan that has been provided by all the employers, and they will then approve that workplace skills plan. So they will then decide that the workplace skills plan is correct or not, and they will then approve it and allow you funding. They will allocate grants to employers, education and training providers and workers, and they will continue to monitor education and training in the sector. They will promote learnerships and registration of learnerships, and they will collect and disperse levies within their sector and liaise with the National Skills Authority on the skills development policy, strategy, and its sector skills plan. Okay. Now, when we have a look at the skills development levy, so who is required to pay a skills development levy and what is it? So any employer who has 500,000 Rand per annum or more in salaries or wages is required to contribute to skills development levy. This, there is an exclusion. So very often people who are NGOs, they are exempt from paying levies. So they would be excluded from that. They can still claim, but they are exempt from the levies. Okay, but most employers who have 500,000 Rand per annum or more in salaries or wages are required to contribute to the levies. How much do they pay? So it's 1% of the total amount in salaries. And this includes overtime, leave, bonuses, commissions, and lump sum payments. So it's quite important when you, so on your skills development reports at the end of the year, it asks you for your total annual salary bill. It is the annual salary bill that aligns to this 1%. Okay. So the amounts deducted or withheld by the employer must then be paid to SARS on a monthly basis, and this is done by completing the monthly employer declaration form. So this gets then paid to SARS, and SARS, which you'll go into now, how is that money allocated and what happens? There are certain people that are excluded from SDL, and it's employers, or at least employees who are employed through the labor broker. So you have a labor broker or labor broking employees, you are not required to pay for that SDL. That would be paid directly by the labor broker. Any retired employee who is receiving a retiring allowance through the company, you would not pay skills development levy for them. Learners who only receive a stipend from you. So if you do have learnerships, you're not obviously then required to also include them within your SDL. And then true independent contractors. So I use the words true independent contractors. Now this is, this is not, there is a test for an independent contractor. And when I say true independent contractors, it's those people that are deemed to be independent contractors by SARS and not deemed to be independent contractors based on a relationship and an agreement that we possibly have at that point. Whereas they're actually employees and they're not independent contractors. Okay, so when we're having a look at the 1% that every single employer over the 500,000 is required to pay, this is how that 1% is distributed. Okay, so 10.5% of it is given to an admin fee. The National Skills Fund, so remembering when we spoke about it earlier, we've looked at Learnerships, ABET, the NSFAS, a fund where they're paying for students who can go and study, is 20% of the 1% goes to the National Skills Fund. And then this element here where we're looking at the mandatory grants and discretionary grants, this is the element that us as employers, can take advantage of. So a majority of the 1% that we're paying every single month goes to the discretionary fund, and we'll go into now, which elements, at least what is part of the discretionary fund and what is part of mandatory. And then a much smaller version will go to the mandatory grants. So you can see as an employer, you can claim if you do your workplace skills plan and your annual training report correctly, you have the ability to claim back 69.5% of the 1% that you have claimed. So if we have a look at how this is, if we just look at a numbers perspective, we assume your salary bill is 2.5 million, it may be more. But if we have a look at that, so your mandatory grant would be, so your total SDL per annum would be 25,000 Rand. You would be able to claim back 5,000 Rand for your mandatory grants. And your mandatory grant, when we go into just now, your mandatory grant, you can get back for submitting your workplace skills plan and your annual training report on an annual basis. I'm sure I do speak into it later, but historically, the mandatory grant used to be much higher. And what happened is they found that people were just submitting the report, but not necessarily providing people with training and development and skills that were going to assist them in the long run. So people would do things like, as an example, time management and those kinds of things. So they weren't really investing in their employees. They were just doing training, or at least saying that they were doing training so they could get 50% of the mandatory grant back, and they weren't really using it for training. So what they then did was they then decreased the amount of the mandatory grant. So the mandatory grant you get just for submitting your workplace skills plan and obviously having it approved is you can get your 5,000 Rand back. So it's a very small amount. Where the big money actually starts to come into is when we're looking at the discretionary fund and things like your National Skills Fund. So if we look at the discretionary fund, of your 25,000, you can get 12,375 Rand back. The National Skills Fund will get 5,000 Rand, and then your admin fee is made up of at least 2,625 Rand. So based on this alone, it doesn't seem very much. Because there are other elements which we'll go through just now, is you have the ability to claim back 17,375 Rand. So, excuse me, when you're looking at your salary bill, it's quite important that you understand where you can start to claim back so that you can adequately put the right things in place in your training plan, your annual workplace skills plan, so that you know where you're going to be getting your money back. All right, if we then have a look at the mandatory grants, now again, as I said, the mandatory grant is not, unless you have a very large salary bill, your mandatory grant you're getting predominantly back because you have submitted your workplace skills plan and your annual training report. they do check that the training that you said you were going to do last year against the training that you have done. Do they marry up, and have you actually done training? If you have done training and you submitted the documents correctly, then you will get your 20% back. Okay, so in order to claim back the mandatory 20%, so the mandatory fund of your STL, you need to submit your workplace skills plan by the 30th of April each year. Because there are some SETAs, and it did happen in 2020, and there are some SETAs that do change that deadline and do allow for extensions due to system errors. But it is a rule of a line in the sand where most SETAs state that you need to submit your workplace skills plan and your annual training report by the 30th of April every year. They do allow for extensions, but it is quite important that if you do need an extension, that you do so quite early on in April. And then normally they will allow the extension, but it is important that you check with your SETA exactly that date. So once you've submitted the workplace skills plan and your annual training report, so this was done recently now, so we've now started receiving correspondence back for any of the clients that we've done saying that your workplace skills plan and annual training reports have been approved, or it's querying, so they start to now process it. Once they've approved your annual training report and workplace skills plan, you then are entitled to receive your 20% mandatory fund. This is supposed to be paid quarterly. It's not always paid quarterly. It does depend on the SETA that you're with. Some SETAs are better than others. Some will pay a lump sum once a year, or random amounts throughout the year. But it should be paid quarterly. You can log onto the portal and you can download your statements. But my experience is that it's not a regular thing that happens where they pay the same amount. They will allocate an amount to you, and then that gets paid when they do their runs. Okay. Now, what will happen is that mandatory grants, and this is where, as an employer, just putting random amounts or at least random things into your annual training report in your workplace skills plan starts to work against you, because when you understand how the money flows, if you start to look at your sector skills plan and you start to put information in that is actual and correct and not just thumbsuck, you start to be able to access money that wasn't necessarily allocated in terms of your 1%. So what then happens now, remembering that every single employer who has a salary bill of more than 500,000, they are paying 1% to the SETAs, or at least they're paying 1% to SARS, who then distributes that money. There are a number of organizations that are not claiming for skills. And so what happens is that 20% that is not being claimed by employers, that is then transferred to the discretionary fund. Now we're sitting in a position, just going back again, where we're looking over here and we're saying 49.5% of your 1% is available for you to claim back within the discretionary fund. There's 20% if everybody is claiming for it that is available to be paid out to every single employer that has paid the money, but that's not the case. So what happens now is that 20% of a lot of employers is now transferred into your discretionary fund. So in as much as you can claim back your 49.5%, there is a lot more money that sits there that is now available for you as an employer if you make application correctly to be given access to that funding. So this is where, so they've now transferred for all the employers that did not claim their 20%, that is now transferred into the discretionary grants. So what happens within the discretionary grants is that funding becomes available during a window period. So each SETA is different. You can go on their website or they will notify you via email. What I find beneficial is you need to establish from your SETA perspective how they work. Sometimes they will do it, like I say, on the website. Find out how your SETA operates. Is it email? Is it website? what do they do? And then you diarize to check on a quarterly basis or on a monthly basis. You go on their website and you check. But what they will do is funding will become available within the discretionary grants. So they will have to spend a certain amount of funding. So the SETA is then told that they have to spend X amount of money during a period of time. And so what they will do is they will make funding available for a month, as an example. The opening of this window is advertised, as I said, either on their website. They will do it in national media. They will also send emails advising that the window is about to open. So they do give you a little bit of leeway, but the window to make that application is very short. Those applications must then reach the SETA by the deadline and must be given, or it must be submitted as required. So the discretionary grants are aimed at encouraging people to contribute towards skills development. So basically what they will do, and I'll show you an example in a minute, but the discretionary funding is basically aimed at pivotal or learning programs. So the purpose of discretionary funding is most of it is aimed at things like learnerships, internships, bursaries, or skills programs. There is an element where you can have, things that don't result in a qualification, but most of the discretionary funding. So what they'll do is they'll open up a window. They will say to everybody within the workplace, we have 15 learnerships, we have 20 internships, we have 5 bursaries available, and we have these 35 skills programs in these particular areas that we are willing to fund. You then have the ability to then say, you will then look at that and you will then say, I've now identified 6 people that I want to send on these things. Sometimes the learnerships are learnerships that they will then give to you, so you won't have the ability to then put people on it. So you can then make application for anybody to go on these things from your workplace. So within that window, you will make that application, and what the SETA will then do is they will agree to pay for that whatever the element is. So they will then say to you, they have 50,000 Rand as an example available for this, and you then go into a partnership with the SETA where they are funding for your person to go on a particular training. And most people end up focusing on the mandatory grants and saying, there's not enough money in there, but this is actually over here where you can get the most money. So if you're looking out on their website and or on emails for this window to open and actually looking at the sector skills plan and seeing what funding is available, you have the ability to actually get much more than the 49.5% back. So as I said just now, most of these training interventions are expected to result in a qualification. So when we look at learnerships and internships and that kind of thing, bursary skills programs, they focus a lot of the discretionary grants on pivotal programs. There are other elements, so there will be elements in softer skills such as time management, etc. But majority of their focus over here is to allow people to come away with a qualification. Okay, as I said just now, a much smaller portion of the funds are allocated to non-pivotal programs, but when you're putting together your workplace skills plan, it's quite important, and I know some people, what they don't do is they don't do anything within the pivotal aspects of their workplace skills plan. It's very important that you make those applications and you put in your workplace skills plan that's what you're intending to do, at least what you want to do. If you say nothing, then the SETA has no idea what it is that you're wanting to do, and so you are never considered for possible training programs down the line. Okay, so as I said before, a few years ago, the mandatory grant was 50% of the SDL, but this was changed to reduce the mandatory grant to 20%. And an element that was then included, which they didn't have before, was the requirement to look at pivotal training. Now, pivotal training, which I spoke about just now, pivotal training is anything that results in a qualification or partial qualification, which is specifically aligned to the National Qualifications Framework, so the NQF levels. And in order to gain access to the discretionary fund, you as the employer must complete your pivotal training program. So in order to gain access to any of these things where they have the discretionary funding, on your workplace skills plan, you must put in your pivotal training plan. So you must say to the CETA that your intention is to train people correctly and to allow them to get a qualification, or at least that's what you're making application for. Okay, so majority, as I said, of the discretionary funding is allocated to pivotal training, and a much smaller portion of the discretionary funds are allocated to the non-pivotal programs. So when funding then becomes available, and this is dependent on the CETA, they will advise us of the following. So they will say, and I'll give you an example of it now, is the specific type of program that you can apply for. So as I said before, we can look at workplace experience, we can look at skills programs, internships, and it will depend on your CETA. So if you recall in the beginning, what I'd said is that as an employer, it's very important that you are in the CETA that aligns to your business. Because as you can start to see now, when we look at discretionary grants, the discretionary, the discretionary grants that are in a particular CETA are going to be aligned to the skills development and the skills shortages of that CETA. So when discretionary funding becomes available, the specific programs will be aligned to that particular CETA. So if you're in the chemical, manufacturing, whatever it is, and you're actually supposed to be, I don't know, in hospitality, I would highly recommend that you look at changing. Okay. Part of the discretionary funding that could become available is they may focus on certain provinces or certain sectors or even certain categories of people. So when the funding becomes available, they may specifically say they're going to focus on people with disabilities. They may focus on people within a specific age group. So there was recently a focus on obviously young people. So trying to upskill people that are just coming to the workplace. And so they might have a bigger issue in one particular province. So all of the discretionary funding that comes available, it could be across the board, is they will then say, these are the people that we're looking at. When the funding becomes available, you obviously don't have to apply for all of it, but you can apply for the programs that apply specifically for you. Okay. And then they will also provide the information of what the applications what applications they will give preference to. So, for example, companies who have not submitted a pivotal training plan within the annual skills report are often not eligible for that grant. So as I was saying, the other thing as well is that what you need to do and how you are often identified as well is in your pivotal training plan. If you've identified that you want, as an example, Nikki, if this funding becomes available and Nikki is now no longer there, you can select another person. So although you'd originally planned for Nikki, if the funding became available to go on this particular workshop or this particular, at least degree, course, whatever it may be, and Nikki is not there, then you can select another candidate. The other thing as well is that within your pivotal training plan, you as the organization can elect to pay for the training upfront, or you can make the application in the hopes that at some point you get the funding. So you can speak to employees and say, I'm making the application. If the funding becomes available through the CETA, then normally what happens, is the CETA will pay 50% up front, and then they will pay 50% upon completion. Or it could be a different amount, but the CETA will be very specific with you as to what they will be paying. So you don't necessarily, as an employer, have to pay for that money upfront. Okay, you can elect to do that, and then if you get the money back from CETA, you can obviously keep that money. But the nice thing about this is that the CETA is now starting to pay for your employees to go get actual qualifications that result in qualifications as opposed to just general training. And if you're using your workplace skills plan correctly and actually looking at your employees, looking at your sector skills plan, so identifying what your CETA is looking at, and then looking at your employees, you are far more likely to be identified as an employer that they will approve for additional funding and approve for discretionary grants, and you will gain access to so much more funding than if you just do the basics within your workplace skills plan and your annual training report. So if you're going to be doing skills on an annual basis, I would highly recommend that you start to investigate those other things, because then you start to make skills work for you. Now, a lot of companies, and I digress a little, a lot of companies, spend a lot of money doing skills development because from a BEE perspective, they need to do it so that they can get their points. Now, excuse me, if you as the organization are going to be investing this amount of time training people, rather try and get the money back from your discretionary funding, and then you also then possibly get access to additional funding over and above this. Rather spend the time trying to get the money back from CETA that you've already paid, but is driving your business into where you know that the CETA has shortages, the industry has shortages, remembering that the sector skills plan is driven by all the reports that are sent through to the CETA. So it's driven by not only your business, but it's driven by the other businesses where we're identifying generally a common shortage and a common, critical and scarce skills. And so all the training and the development that the CETA is looking at and the National Skills Fund is looking at will then also be driven in the same way. So you can then meet both your BEE objectives as well as your skills objectives, and not just ticking a box. And you now have people that you can, sign agreements with and keep their skills internally, get their education paid for, and then keep them for a while, within the business, because that education has now been paid for. Okay, so this is an example of discretionary funding that has become available. Obviously, it's in a particular industry, but what will happen is so this was in TETA, which is transport. So they will then say, for example, that they have within truck drivers, production coordinators, and transport clerks, is the specialization is cement mixer driver, and so they go. And within that particular, those 6 or 7 of them at the top there, the intervention that was planned by the CETA for those particular specializations were learnerships. Then we have a tilt tray driver, and what they were looking at for that particular one was a skills program. And so they go down. So they can specify in what particular jobs they want to do certain things and what they're going to do and what they're going to fund within that specific area. Then what they'll do is they could also then be saying, in addition to the above occupations, applicants can then also apply for these things. So they will then say, for example, that they are going to apply for, so there's 74 learners that they want to pay for within bursaries. They'll do a PhD and master's for 8 and then 1 subsector. They will also do bursaries in a CET college, learnerships for 1,200 learners, and so they go. And these are the kinds of things, and each CETA is different. Some are obviously better than others, but each CETA will do this, not at the same time, but they will then share this information to let you know what it is. So you can then make the application to say, as an example, in your particular industry, we want to take, 5 people on apprenticeships. That's what we want to do. You may be doing that already within your workplace, but now you can get it funded by the CETA. Or you want to, send someone on a degree course. So depending on what it is and depending on what bursaries they want to do, it might work for you within your business. Remembering it's not always specific to the particular industry that you're in. And what I mean by that is if everybody is doing in manufacturing, you still have office related jobs that could fall within this as well. So you could have people that need to go on an accounting degree, or you have office management, or you could have, like you can see here, they've got PhD and masters. So it's not always specific to the actual task that is performed by your business, but you could have the peripheral jobs, or at least the support jobs, that are also included within here. Okay, so I hope that that makes sense to everybody. Just very briefly, just talking about learnerships. So what a learnership is, and a learnership is, I will go into it, but basically a learnership, there has been some confusion with some people, but a learnership is not something that you as the business just create. So a learnership is a work-based learning program. So just to be clear, you can have a trainee at your workplace. It is not necessarily a learnership. A learnership is actually a defined thing that through the, it's defined by SARS, it's defined by CETA, and there's specific organizations that will give learnerships, and it's a specific program that people will go on. So you cannot employ someone and design your own program and then suddenly call it a learnership, because it's not. So from a BE perspective, as well as a SARS perspective, it's not the same thing. So a learnership is a work-based learning program that ultimately leads to a qualification at the end of it. So depending on the learnership that the person will go on will depend on the actual qualification that they will get. It is, however, directly linked to an occupation or field of work. So generally, a learnership would be, so example, electrical engineering, it could be hairdressing, depending again on the industry, that could be specific to you. It could be project management, and learnerships are managed by the CETAs. So when we look, so you have learnerships. So what will happen is your CETA, as I said before, will say we are doing 1,000. So in this particular example here, they said they're doing 1,200 learnerships, national certificates, and occupational qualifications. They will be very clear. So when we go further into the discretionary funding applications, they will be very clear what actual learnerships they're going to be on offer. So depending on the industry, they will then tell you, are they doing, hairdressing, or are they doing project management? Are they doing, and as I said before, it is not always, it is not always task driven, i.e. so if you're in manufacturing, it's not always the jobs on the floor or the specific type of skill there. It could also very well be your office based. And you'll also see here, so just to be clear, so in this particular application, they said 1,200 employed learners and 1,500 unemployed learners. So it could be somebody who you employ as a brand new employee, or somebody who's employed, or it could be people that are not employed. So you just need to be clear when you're looking at the application, what type of person that it is that you're looking for. So learnerships are generally available for young people who are just leaving school, college, or any other training institution. It is not generally for somebody who is already working for you or has been working for you for years. A learnership is actually required, or not required, a learnership is actually there to allow a person to get both a qualification as well as workplace experience. It can also be for people who have been unemployed for some time. And remembering with a learnership, what they're also trying to do is to create a pool of people who ultimately end up with a qualification, but a pool of people that you have had within your business that have worked for you. And at the end of it, their hope is that you may employ them. But even if you don't, and there's no obligation for you to employ them, but if you don't employ them, the hope, and I think for many employers, having someone within your business who has learned what you do, it's easier to employ that person because you know them and you know who they are than finding someone who you've never met, obviously at a lower level. Okay, so people entering a learnership must be at least 16 years old and must be younger than 35. So you can't have obviously people that are older than that. So it's specifically aimed at people who are young. Now, just to be clear, with a learnership, it is not necessarily always specific from a BE perspective. So from BE, your learnerships and the things, the training that you're going to do there will obviously be specific, and you will get the points if the learners are Black, which is African, Indian, colored. From a CETA perspective, the funding that you're going to get is not specifically, unless the application is very specific, like I mentioned in the beginning, is they could say they are focusing on, in this instance, African females, because there might be a shortage of African females within this particular skill set that they need within the workplace. But that's not always the case. They may say that it's open to anybody. So from a CETA perspective, it's not the same as equity and BEE. You can make application for any staff member, unless, of course, the application is specific that they want a particular group of person. Okay, so what is the process with your learnerships? So the employer must be approved. So you as the employer would make application to, and again, so this is why as an employer, you need to understand that a learnership is not just something that you create by yourself. So you as the employer must be approved by the CETA. The people who provide the training, so remembering with the learnership, what will happen is the learner will then come to your workplace, will be provided with on-the-job experience and on-the-job learning, and then they will also, depending on what it is, they will also go and learn in a classroom type of style. So there will be a training provider that must be accredited with the CETA and for that particular learnership. So the learnership is a particular program, and ultimately at the end, they will write tests, exams, or whatever it is that they need to do, and they will need to pass that qualification. There is a qualified assessor that must be available to assess the individuals. That could be so internal, or you can contract that person in. Very often, if you do a learnership through a training provider, they will have an assessor. Individuals then apply for the learnerships. The learners are then selected by the company, so you can select who it is that you want. And there is a learnership agreement that is signed between the learner, the employer, and the training provider. So there are things that all three parties have to bring to the table. You as the employer then sign an employment contract. It is a short-term contract, so you could call it a learnership contract if you want, but it is a fixed-term contract for the duration of the learnership. At the end of the learnership, there's no obligation for you as the employer to take that person on. So as the employer, it's a nice opportunity for you to increase skills, to have labor that is very often cheap, and because you get it funded by the CETA, and then at the end of it is you have now, more people that you can possibly choose from. So the employer and the training provider then provide the relevant learning and experience. As I said before, the learnership is funded via the employer through the grant received from the CETA. So the CETA will then fund the learner. They will pay the employer, and the employer then can pay that learner. Often with a learnership, though, is the learner very often doesn't get paid very much. They might get a stipend because the benefit that the learner is getting is obviously the skills and experience and a qualification that they're not paying for. Many of the clients that we work with will pay the person anyway, and they will give them a stipend, or they will give them something for the duration of that learnership. Okay. Ultimately, at the end, the learner is assessed by a qualified assessor, and he or she will then receive a national qualification. At the end of the learnership, the employer can then elect to employ the learner after the completion, or learners, depending on how many there are, after the completion of that learnership. Then we have an apprenticeship. So an apprenticeship and a learnership is obviously different. An apprenticeship is a system of training people within a trade or profession with on-the-job training, and often accompanies some sort of study or classroom work. An apprenticeship then also enables people to get a license. So this is very often, within a particular profession or trade. So for example, welders, there used to be a lot of apprenticeships, very long ago. I'm not sure how many do it now. It's very often within a particular trade. And they will very often last between 3 to 6 years. And people who successfully complete their apprenticeship reach what is called journeyman or professional certification level of competence within their particular field. So when we go back to the applications that the CETA will allow you to do, it's important to understand what the difference is between those. So you've got your learnership, you've got your apprenticeship, and then we have what people call as internship. Now, an internship is generally something that you just do for you as the employer. It's not specific to any particular industry, and it could be something that you specifically apply within your environment. Now, if we look from a BEE perspective, an internship has very specific rules. And so it's important that when we're making application for any of these things, if you're doing BEE and you're doing employment equity and you're doing skills, you should try and marry the three up to make sure that you are you're getting the best out of all of these things with all the work that you're doing, that you're getting the best. So if you're going to do skills development, if you're going to do apprenticeships, internships, learnerships, or just general training, is that you also then have a look at what is your BE required and what is your employment equity required, so that we can try and make sure that when we're looking at all three, that we're getting the best out of it. Okay. And then just finally, because we got 5 minutes left, all of these things that I've spoken about is if you don't submit your annual skills report or your annual training report. So we have a training report that we need to submit on an annual basis. The annual training report, or very often referred to as the ATR, or Workplace Skills Plan, which is the WSP, and Pivotal Training Plan, PTP, is submitted by the 30th of April every single year. And it's quite important that you do that and you don't miss a year. If you do miss a year, you are then not entitled to get your discretionary funding. So any of the funding that they bring available, any cash injection that they now have from the National Skills Fund to do extra training within the discretionary grant, is you will then not be able to access this. This thing that I'm talking about today is not necessarily about the mandatory fund, or at least the mandatory grants. It's the being able to access this huge amount of training, or at least this huge amount of funding that is available if you're submitting the right reports. Okay, so your annual skills reporting, to claim your mandatory and discretionary funding, you need to submit the annual training report, your workplace skills plan, and your pivotal training report by the 30th of April every year. Okay, as I said before, your workplace skills plan ideally should document, and this is probably more important than, your annual training report is basically just reporting on the training you've done. This over here is probably this and your pivotal training plan, the most important part of your whole document. So your workplace skills plan should document the skills your company needs and describe the range of skills development interventions that you want to use to address these needs. Your workplace skill plan should also outline how you are going to address training and development needs within the workplace. It helps you to identify and provide relevant training that addresses skills gaps. So looking at skills gaps analysis and skills shortages, as an employer throughout the year, I would highly recommend looking at skills audits. It doesn't have to be a complicated process. It doesn't have to be very high level, but identifying what skills you actually need for each job, and then identifying the shortages, and then reporting on that within your workplace skills plan. But not only just reporting on that, is having a look at then the sector skills plan to say, these are the skills shortages that I have. This is actually what I need in order for people to do their jobs correctly. What does my CETA say that they are going to be focusing on this year? Because very often the shortages that you're having, what your CETA is going to focus on, are going to be aligned. Okay. And then going back to the workplace skills plan, it is normally completed by a skills development facilitator or another qualified person. And that could be your HR person. I would recommend that it's somebody who's qualified to understanding skills development, so it can be done correctly. Your WSP can also include any training interventions that you would like to implement to assist with the skills gaps in your company. So it's basically sharing with the seater what it is that you're wanting to do. And this is quite important because when they're identifying where they want to share skills and where they're wanting to upskill within your particular industry, is if they have a cash injection from the National Skills Fund and say, there we go, you've got this money, I need you to now spend it. They will look at that workplace skills plan. If what you have on that workplace skills plan aligns with them, they can then specifically come to you and say, you have been approved for X amount of money for these 15 things that you put on your workplace skills plan. And again, this doesn't necessarily always have to be. I recently had a client that was approved for 58,000 Rand for, it was COVID training, but it was training all of their people in the right processes within COVID. So it wasn't specifically a qualification, but it was first aid training from a COVID perspective, which they had put in their workplace skills plan. And as I said, this can include internal or external training. It can include pivotal or non-pivotal. And then your pivotal training plan, which is hugely important, is this is something that you must complete, even if you're only putting, a small amount of stuff in there. If you don't put the pivotal training plan, and very often you're then not entitled to the discretionary funding that comes through. Okay. This training over here, I would also highly recommend that majority of your pivotal training should be anything that results in a qualification or works towards getting a qualification. Okay, and you can make application for this without necessarily having to enroll the person right off the bat. So if you put it into your workplace skills plan, or at least you put it into your report, at least it's there, and the seater then now knows that you're doing it, and they can then at any point then decide that they wish to pay for it, or at least allow you the opportunity to select someone to go on that course. Okay, and then finally, we've got our annual training reports. Now this, again, so I have put in the days here, which is the 1st of April. This is just an example. Some seaters are slightly different in that they will go January to December. It is important that you know what period you're looking at, but your annual training report reflects the training that has been completed in the previous year, whatever year that is. Most seaters go April to March, but some seaters do go January to December. This report reflects how well you have or have not implemented or delivered on the training measures that you said that you were going to do within your workplace skills plan. It has to include the interventions that were conducted, both internal, external, pivotal, and non-pivotal. You must provide proof of expenditure and attendance registers. So specifically, and a lot of clients don't, so any on-the-job training, any training that you're providing within the workplace, so it could be one staff member training another one, whatever it may be, is start getting into the habit of attendance registers, even for internal training. Then employees that were trained, including age, race, gender, occupational category, the learning methods used, and this will obviously be specific based on your specific seater, what your training budget was, and then an organizational survey, which includes identifying your scarce and critical skills. And that is basically, from a skills development perspective, how the flow works. And, if you start looking at your skills, not just as a box to be ticked, but rather trying to work within the seater and within your seater to identify where their focus areas are, you are, as I said before, you're more likely to actually gain access to that funding. Remembering, if we go back to the beginning, there's a larger portion of money, so the 1%, where people are not actually claiming that money back. It isn't being spent. And so the seaters, remembering within, if we go to their purpose and what they're supposed to do, they have a very specific function. And if they don't meet their obligations, them as a seater can actually be closed down. So they have a very specific job that they have to do. And so if we can try and make it, inverted commas, easier for them, by identifying training that we want to do that fits in with their sector skills plan, we're far more likely to gain access to that funding, which then works for us if we're doing BEE as well, because we can get the money back that we've had to spend. So that is the webinar today. I hope that I've made it a little easier to understand. I hope that, you know, from a skills perspective, as you can start to see it slightly differently. If anybody does need any assistance, you're more than welcome to email us. You can email us on info@hrtalk.co.za. Alternatively, you can email me directly at Nikki, which is NICKY, @hrtalk.co.za. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I have one question that has come up. Can you access CETA funding from a different CETA you belong to if the skills aligned? No, you can only really access funding from your particular CETA. You can't access funding from another CETA. Okay, there's another question. I work at a school and we have about 20 students working here. They receive a stipend monthly and in return assist teachers in the classroom. I've always paid them monthly 1%. So no, so if they're learners and they're receiving a stipend, you can check that. I'll have to double check that, but learners receiving a stipend you shouldn't be paying the 1% for them, no. Are there any other questions? So if there are no other questions, I want to thank everybody for attending today. As I've mentioned before, you are more than welcome to email me directly. I wish you well and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you, everybody.